Welcome to our monthly Ascina talk. My name is Thomas Wallner from the Chicago and Midwest chapter, and thanks for joining. I'm really excited about the great turnout, but I think that's due to Petra and her really interesting topic. So
No pressure.
no pressure at all, of course. Before we get started, just a quick heads up. There will be another Ascina talk this year, scheduled for December. The date is yet to be confirmed. Our friends at the Washington, D.C. chapter will be hosting that next call. So stay tuned for that. There'll be more information coming out via email and our social media channels. And with that, let me briefly introduce today's speaker, Dr. Petra Stieninger. Petra Hurtado, I should say. Sorry, Petra, I've known you long enough where I may make that mistake. So Petra is the research director at the American Planning Association, heading APA's research programs and foresight practice. In this role, she is responsible for expanding a future-focused research agenda and advancing planning practices that assist communities in navigating change. Her areas of expertise and research include urban sustainability, smart cities, emerging technologies, nature-based solutions, and environmental psychology. Prior to joining APA, she worked as an advisor, planner, researcher, and educator in the global urban sustainability arena. Petra holds a PhD in urban planning from the Vienna University of Technology, where she teaches on urban sustainability and environmental psychology. Additionally, she has been a guest lecturer at Harvard GSD, Loyola University in Chicago, as well as the Universidad Tecnología de Bolívar in Colombia. And with that, Petra's title for today, in case you haven't seen it yet, is The Future of Cities in a Post-Pandemic World. So a really timely topic. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Petra. Thanks again for agreeing to give in this presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for having me. This is really exciting. Let me share my screen here. Okay, and I'm gonna just click this here away. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, coming through perfect, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so the future of cities in a post-pandemic world. And just setting the right expectations here, not wanting to disappoint you, but I will probably leave you with more questions than answers after this presentation, but that is okay. That's the world we're living in. So yeah, COVID-19. One can really say the future is more unknowable than ever before. And there's various reasons for that. But one thing that we've been seeing is that it's not just that the only constant is change, but the only constant is accelerating change. And that acceleration can be seen in technological innovations. It can be seen in climate change. It can be seen in societal changes. And now on top of all of that, we added a pandemic that turned cities and communities really upside down. Now for us as urban planners, the big question is really, what are temporary fixes and what will be permanent solutions? And going a little further, another question that we are wondering about is really if COVID-19 is just a rehearsal for all the other things that are to come. And we really have not just one curve that we need to fit. There are several other curves that we need to fit. And those are climate change, social inequality, and now with COVID, this economic downturn that need to be fixed. So with all of this in mind, at APA, the American Planning Association, we started a foresight practice last year, actually before COVID started. And that foresight practice is meant to help to navigate the change and to navigate uncertainty. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about this foresight practice and what we're doing there. I'm going to explain how we use that to make sense out of what's happening with COVID-19 right now. And then I'm going to talk about two specific examples on how we approach this and how we want to make sense of potential futures here. So The question is, of course, why does APA talk about foresight and the future? And I always like to use these two definitions or these two quotes on what planners do or how do you define a planner's job. And so the one is by Jolly Hoke, professor at UIC, who said in his book What Planners Do, planners compose and offer advice on preparing for an uncertain future. And then the second one by Tim Keene, the current planning director of the city of Atlanta. He said planners help communities navigate change. So no pressure there. Obviously, planners have a lot to do with the future and need to help their communities tackle that. So at APA, we want to be able to help planners tackle their work and help them become future ready. Now, one thing that's important here is in our foresight practice, we're not predicting the future. No one can predict the future. I asked our IT department to figure out how to build a time machine. So until they figure that out, we still need to do foresight. And what does that mean? So it's about learning with the future. And so it's really about understanding what are the things that are happening around us, what are the things that are shaping our operating environment that are not necessarily under our control, and how can we learn about these things and how can we prepare for them. So that's really the idea of what we're doing here. So the way we look at the future, we have a time cone or a trend radar. And so we're really looking at 3 time frames. So when you look here at the left, this is where we are today, and then we move towards the future, towards the right. So the first time frame is the ACT time frame. That's where we are today. Those are things where we already see pain points in communities and cities in the planning profession that we need to work on, that we need to address. Further out in the future, there are some trends and things that we can see that they are pretty certain that they will happen, and we can already start preparing for those. And then even further out into the future, there's trends that we might not really understand yet, that we don't know yet if they will actually really happen or not. And so we need to keep watching them to see how they change, and we need to learn about them. And this cone essentially shows how the further you move into the future, the more uncertainty you see. Now, how did we use this in this whole COVID context? So we were sticking to our 3 time frames, but we adapted them to what's happening with COVID. So in the spring, when COVID started, the ACT phase became the emergency response phase. So that's really when we looked at pain points that communities were dealing with. We looked at pain points that planners were dealing with, and we tried to come up with quick solutions to be able to keep, running alive, to be able to plan and keep doing what planners are doing. The next phase, which is the phase we're in right now, is this interim phase between, when the whole pandemic hit and the transition to when we will have a vaccine or a cure. So in this phase, we're really observing changing behavior from interim solutions to long-term strategies. And the big question here is really, what are the temporary fixes and what will be permanent? And the longer this phase is going to take, the higher the probability is that some of these changes will be permanent. And of course, then the third time frame, the one that we're still watching, monitoring, and learning about, is this future new normal after we have a vaccine, after most people are vaccinated. What is really the future of cities going to look like in this post-pandemic world? Now, in our foresight practice, we're doing research in 5 trend categories. So we're looking at societal trends, at technological trends, economic trends, environmental trends, and political trends. And we try to connect all of these trends on how they impact cities and communities and how they impact the planning profession, so the daily work planners do. And we're also looking at 4 types of trends and how they connect with disruption. So in general, in our foresight practice, we look at existing trends that will continue and may get to a point of disruption in the future. For example, the US population is aging, and that could that could result in a disruption if we don't address it as planners. We look at existing trends that got disrupted or accelerated by disruptors. So current example with COVID-19, the digitalization got accelerated. We're looking at new trends and potential new trends that may result in potential impacts or disruption in the future. Our favorite right now is artificial intelligence and what that will do to cities, but also what it will do and how planners do their work. And then the fourth one is new trends and potential new trends that result from current disruptors, where we, in the context of COVID, we're looking a lot on changes in the public realm. Now for this presentation, talking about COVID-19, I will obviously focus on these two types. So the trends that got either disrupted or accelerated by COVID, and potential new trends resulting from COVID. And because we only have 1 hour, I will really focus on these two trends specifically: the digitalization of life as an accelerated trend and changes in the public realm as potential new trends. I'm going to start with the public realm and looking at what has happened over the last months. We learned quite a bit about our cities. So when we talk about physical distancing and shelter in place, our cities were really not built for that. And especially when you look at US cities, and that applies to many other cities in the world as well, cities were built for cars and not really for people. So the majority of public space in US cities is either for streets or for parking, so really built for cars. In addition to that, when you look at the sidewalk designs, they're really too narrow to be able to physical distance if a person comes your way on the same sidewalk. There's also a lack of parks and public spaces and green spaces throughout neighborhoods. So obviously during the shelter in place times when everyone's working from home, you won't go downtown to the big central park. So green space is not surrounding every neighborhood, is not present in every neighborhood right now. In addition, a lot of public spaces aren't really destinations. They are more tied to programming, which is not happening right now. And then in addition to all that, when we look at how people move around town, public transit is really focused on rush hour times. So if you want to avoid crowds to be able to physically distance, but you need to take public transit and you want to say, okay, let's just break out of the 9 to 5 working cycle, that's difficult in the US because a lot of these public transit systems don't even offer services during other times or have very sporadic services and not the high frequency that you find around the regular rush hour times. And then, of course, some people wanted to switch to riding their bikes or walking. And also here, we don't have the right infrastructure in place to actually do that in a safe way. So yeah, cities were not really made for this situation. Now let's dive a little deeper into the lack of parks and green spaces in cities, because COVID-19 has really elevated the value of green space and public space. And when we look at the last couple of decades or even more, people have been disconnecting from nature. So the daily exposure to nature has been decreasing. And what is really shocking is when you look at some numbers of the times how much time children are spending outside or in nature, they spend less time than prison inmates who have required times to be outside. So that's a pretty shocking situation there. And again, most public space in cities is for parking and not for parks. And during this pandemic, looking at some mobility trends here, or over half of the destinations of all trips in the US were parks. So during this shelter in place time, people were really understanding that they need to get out of their houses, that they need to get into nature and really connect with nature. At the same time, more than 100 million people in the US live more than a 10-minute walk from a park. And we're not talking about, like this can be any tiny little park to a big park. So there's a lot of people who need to walk more than 10 minutes to get to a park. And that obviously has a negative effect on your daily exposure to nature because you don't want to get out of your way to get to your park. So in addition to that, obviously there's a lot of studies out there that talk about the benefits of nature. So there's social benefits, there's economic benefits, there's environmental benefits. But what became really clear during this pandemic is the need for nature for physical and mental health. And this is a topic I could probably talk for 5 hours just about this topic. But to make it short, it's when you have a park or some sort of nature next to your house, the chances that you go for a walk or a run or just do some physical activities are much higher than if you don't. And so knowing that obesity is a big problem, putting parks into neighborhoods could be a solution to that problem. And at the same time, there's multiple studies out there that show the effect on mental health from nature, like stress reduction, higher concentration rates. It helps with depression and other mental illnesses. All of this is not really acknowledged and recognized by the politicians who make the decisions on where to put parks and to actually integrate parks into our healthcare systems. Now, these things surfaced during COVID because especially the population groups that are mostly affected with COVID and where the higher rates of death could be recognized with COVID, those are also the population groups who don't have nature in their neighborhoods. And so that's something that really cities and city leaders became aware of during this time. So the question is, now there are some temporary fixes happening, and the question is, are those opportunities for permanent change? So a lot of cities across the country really started turning streets into living rooms and turning parking into parks. So we have shared streets and space for recreation where streets were just closed and people could go there and kids could play there. Restaurants were allowed to use streets for their outdoor seating. And then obviously prioritizing pedestrians and bicyclists on these streets. So that's a total new movement in the US. And in addition to that, cities understood that public space and green space can also be used for economic recovery. So there are some cities that acknowledge urban farming as a solution to economic recovery. Obviously, the restaurants were allowed to use outdoor seating, to put outdoor seating on the streets. And then you can also create new jobs with just the maintenance and the establishing these spaces. So what is really interesting here is that the biggest challenge for all of this always was the behavior change and the political will. And right now we see this cultural shift happening, and that gives us hope that this might actually become a long-term trend. Now, obviously, we're still very early in the game, and we can't really say from what we see right now that this is really going to happen across the country. But there are some signals for this permanent change. So cities like Seattle and others have already made some of these shared streets permanent. And Seattle is the city where it's the most extensive with 20 miles. But then there's also cities like Chicago, for example. These survey results here show us that the cities are really talking to their communities now and try to figure out what do they want, what do they need, so they can live through this, but how can we actually make some of these things really permanent? And it seems like that a lot of people in Chicago would like to keep their shared streets, me included. And so it's great to see that the cities are actually really going into the communities now and talking to the people what makes most sense. Also, of course, we see now restaurants are getting ready for the winter. There's big investments being made to accommodate a safe dining outside in winter temperatures, and also the street art that comes with it raises the question of is this really just for one winter, or are those ideas that we should actually keep for the long term? So as I said, more questions than answers, but there are signals that show us there will probably be some some permanent change in the public realm in the future. Now, let's go to the second trend, and that is the digitalization. And there's a lot to unpack here. So we're talking about, when we talk about the digitalization, we talk about working from home, we talk about e-commerce and online shopping, online schooling, online universities. We have online entertainment nowadays, online theaters and online operas. We have online conferences, and so on. So everything in life, almost every aspect in life, was transformed to a digital version right now. So starting with working from home, this has been a trend for a while. It actually started in the 1970s when the oil prices went up. That was the first time when people said, well, I can't afford my commute anymore. And so companies started to accommodate for that. It got accelerated in the 1990s, obviously, because people got their personal computer and internet, but also with the Americans with Disabilities Act that also had some regulations for employers to accommodate. And if someone is not able to access an office or whatever the workplace is, then they had to accommodate with remote work. So that's a trend that's been there for a while. It went to a high in 2019 with about 20% of the US workforce being able to work from home. So that means once a week at least, 20% were working from home already in 2019. But then when we look at how COVID-19 accelerated this trend, in April of this year, there were more than 60% of the US workforce that were working from home. Now, of course, when you look at places like Chicago downtown, it's empty right now. And the question is this going to be here to stay? And so looking at some studies and surveys, there are, again, some signals that tell us some of this might stay, probably not 100%, but there are already more than 2/3 of all companies that were surveyed by the Business Insider wanna keep it that way. They wanna they realize now that they save a lot of money. They don't have to pay office rent. And obviously with this economic downturn, anywhere where you can save money as a company is a good thing. And then there's also the majority or most of the employees feel pretty comfortable with this working from home situation, knowing that there's a lot of time saved if you don't have to commute. And you can do all these other things while you're working, like doing laundry and stuff like that. So that's really convenient. So again, the question is this here to stay? Probably not completely, but a big portion of it will probably. Now, when we look at online shopping, similar situation. This trend has been here for over 20 years. It has been increasing for over 20 years. But looking at what happened this year, it's really e-commerce is projected to grow by nearly 20%, and that is about a 5-year jump. So whatever the increase would have been over the next 5 years has happened in 1 year in 2020. In addition to that, shopping malls have been struggling over the last year, and there's predictions that say that over 50% of department stores in malls in the US are predicted to close in 2021. So again, is this really going to happen? We don't know yet, but there's enough signals to let us believe that at least a lot of the online shopping will stay online, and a lot of stores have already closed and more will close because of that. Now, I could go on and on and on. Obviously, I mentioned universities are online right now. So all these campuses are all empty right now. Conferences are online, so convention centers are unused. Same with theaters, opera houses. So Zoom is really the new place to meet and socialize. Now, this takes me to the question, what's the future of the city in all of this? And as a planner, of course, I have to start with the question, what's the future of land use planning? Obviously, there are a lot of implications for zoning. I'm not going to bore you with zoning codes here, but we're really seeing the situation of live, work, play in one place. So, and that place is home. And there are going to be some substantial impacts on the downtown areas, the business districts, and the shopping malls. So when we look at people working from home, and again, just if you go downtown Chicago, for example, it's empty right now, and all these offices are unused right now. So is this going to stay as extreme as it is right now? Probably not, but a substantial number of companies won't go back to their offices. So there will for sure be obsolete commercial spaces downtown. And, in addition to the office spaces, there that results in a lack of clients for all these surrounding businesses like restaurants, coffee shops, and the stores that you usually have around your office. So this might have major impacts on downtown areas. At the same time, when we look at the neighborhoods, at the residential neighborhoods where we have this live, work, play situation right now, um, there will be a growing demand for downtown amenities. So if you work from home, you still want to be able to have your takeout lunch. You still want to be able to have your takeout coffee and maybe go to the gym in the lunch break. And you want to do your errands after work and not have to drive half hour through town to get to a store. So there will be more demand for those amenities in our neighborhoods. And in addition to that, what I mentioned earlier, the demand for green space in our neighborhoods is also already recognized. So the question in our land use planning foresight practice is, are we moving towards decentralized mixed use communities? So instead of having a centralized downtown in a city and a business district that everything is going towards, is every neighborhood going to be a self-sustained mixed use decentralized little community, little village in a city? Again, signals show us it could be, but we don't know what's really going to happen. Now, of course, that leads us to the question of the future of transportation. And there's a lot to unpack here too, but the main question really is, does location still matter? So if people work from home, if people go to school from home, if people watch entertainment from home, there is bigger impacts on transportation behavior, but also on commuter patterns when it comes to work changes. And what is really interesting here is we read about this in the news a lot about public transit systems losing their clients and all this. But what is really an almost bigger problem here is, what about the people who can't work remotely? So there's still a lot of people who need to go to work. And a lot of these people are people who take public transit. Now, if the numbers are staying low as they are right now, public transit might not economically be feasible anymore. So what can we do so those people can still get to their jobs? And in addition to that, putting COVID-19 aside, the transportation sector has been accelerating over the last decade. So when we used to, have our horses and horse carriages, and obviously then the railroads came, and then the car was invented, there were really long times in between, like centuries in between these inventions. And suddenly we have, within a decade, new transportation systems joining our cities, and no one is prepared for them. So in addition to having struggling public transit and the big question of what's going to happen with the usual commuter traffic, we need to deal with transportation network companies like Uber or Lyft and how they fit into the mix. We suddenly find scooters on our street that no one knows where they should be allowed to go. But we also need to look further out into the future and figure out how autonomous vehicles will fit in this picture. And also urban air mobility is a topic that's becoming more and more present. So the transportation system, to be totally honest, is a complete mess right now, because no one really knows what is going to happen here. And a lot will depend on how all these other things will change in terms of, will people go back to work? Will people go back to universities? And what's the situation with freight delivery in terms of, are we going to have still stores, or is it going to be online shopping? Now, I know this is an extreme scenario, but there's, again, a lot of open questions. But coming back to the question of, does location still matter? Um, yes, but probably in a different way. So when we look so far, what was always the theme was the location of jobs. And that might change towards the locations where you actually have access to internet, because that is really the access to the jobs in many cases. And that takes me to the third question here that we are wondering about, and that's the digital divide. So tens of millions of Americans don't have access to internet or can't afford high quality internet. And if jobs and education and goods and services are all available online, then are these people going to be excluded from jobs and from education and from all these goods and services? So that's also a big issue, especially with, knowing that there's a lot of people who don't have that access. And right now during COVID, there were a lot of private sector companies who actually went out in these neighborhoods, in these places where people don't have access, and provided Wi-Fi networks, so people can actually, or students can at least go to school and don't miss out on their education. But it is a clear wake-up call, and especially for planners who are obviously also dealing with infrastructure systems, that broadband internet is really going to be more and more important, no matter how extreme the scenario of digitalization will really work out. It is obvious it is an important utility nowadays. And the interesting discussion here actually is that when you look at past pandemics or epidemics, um, there have always been some sort of infrastructure systems coming out of pandemics. So for example, the sewer systems, they came out because people got sick from the dirty streets and the dirty cities. And the question right now is really, is the new essential utility coming out of COVID-19 going to be the broadband internet? And we realize it's just as essential as other systems are, and it's not a luxury anymore to have internet. So that was a lot. Obviously, there are some bigger thoughts on putting all of this together and what could this mean. And one thing that we as planners obviously look at COVID-19 is it could really spur a paradigm shift in how we use urban space. And now, obviously, that's the planner talking from their hearts and talking about their dreams. It is all always connected with the political will that can actually make it happen. But we do see a big chance here to actually correct mistakes from the past. And planners have made a lot of mistakes in the past, as we learned through this pandemic. So obviously equity and the importance of the neighborhood, really equal distribution of green space, um, making broadband an essential infrastructure and creating all the amenities we need across the city and not just in a central area is going to be a big topic. Obviously, we've been talking about climate change and environmental responsibility. We see the behavior change happening. We see the cultural shift happening. So now it's just really a matter of taking it on and not putting it aside because everything COVID related is more important. Um, Also, the whole public health issue and how it is connected to land use and urban design, the nature deficit in our cities, and the equitable distribution of nature and needed amenities. And then when you look at some of these trends that I talked today, and there's more with similar patterns, we see a lot of obsolete spaces coming in our cities, like the commercial space, the office spaces and retail spaces that might become obsolete. I didn't talk about the trends of autonomous vehicles in more detail, but there is also we see transportation related spaces becoming obsolete with traffic moving to other systems. And at the same time, on the other side, we have a need for nature, and we also have a big need for affordable housing. And putting those together could become a really good solution. But The question is, will the politicians actually really think about that and do it? Now, summarizing all of that, obviously we're not suspecting at any time going back to what used to be normal. Some things might, but a lot of things won't. And as planners, we really see this as an opportunity to make equitable and resilient cities a new normal. And obviously, we hope that that movement is really gonna, or that the door is open. We hope that people will go through it. Now, one last thing here. Obviously, as planners, we're thinking a lot about how can planning be improved? How can planning fit into this better? And when we look at the future of urban planning, there's a few things that we feel like need to change about how city planning is done right now. So first of all, and really importantly, planners need to become more aware of the future and become or practice more strategic foresight. So right now what planners are doing is really creating a vision for the next 10 years of how their community should look like in 10 years. But a lot of times they don't take into consideration trends and things that are happening around them that they don't have control over, but that will have impacts on their communities. So that's something that planners need to become better in. At the same time, planning is a very white profession, and the population in the US is becoming more and more diverse. So if you want to plan for a diverse community, you need to have a diverse team to understand everyone's needs and what's actually happening in your city. The third thing is acknowledging this acceleration of change and now understanding what disruption like a pandemic can do to our cities also tells us that planning needs to become more agile. So methods like design thinking and agile methods are really needed in planning because we can't just think in 10-year horizons. We need to be able to prototype, to pilot, and to figure things out along the way as they happen, because innovation is really faster than what we are doing in planning. Um, Additionally, planning needs to be fact-based. And when we look at the media, there's a lot of emotional discussions and a lot of different things right now. But planners still need to filter out what are the facts and what is fiction or what is just a thought of someone who wanted to share their opinion. But at the same time, they need to be inclusive. So we do have to talk with the community. We do have to go out and talk what the needs are of the community. And then planning is a or should be a people-centric process. So it's really about the community and the public good. But looking at all these technological developments around us, and as we learned with the digitalization, it has a lot of impacts on the cities and the built environment and the way we use our land. And so planning really needs to be people-centric, but also technologically advanced. And then last but not least, systems thinking and scenario planning is becoming more and more important for us as planners, as we see how all of these things are interconnected. Again, digitalization, you would think, okay, well, now things move from paper to computer. No, it's not just that. It's really the digitalization of processes and the digital transformation of entire systems. And all of that is connected and is very strongly connected to land use planning, to transportation planning, and other planning related things. So we're going to be busy with EPA over the next years, I guess. And that's it from my presentation. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them or try to answer them.